I knew Vivian Blackwood despised me from the moment I married her son, but I never imagined she'd leave me stranded in a foreign country. The morning air was crisp as I watched her silver Mercedes pull away from our rented chateau in the Loire Valley, my husband Gideon in the passenger seat, both of them laughing as they disappeared down the winding driveway. My suitcase still sat in our bedroom, my passport and wallet locked in the hotel safe that only Gideon knew the code to. Let's see how you get home without my son and without any money. Vivian's shrill voice echoed in my ears as I stood frozen at the window, still in my nightgown, unable to process what was happening. 20 minutes earlier, I had been sleeping in the guest room after a particularly nasty argument with Gideon. It had been brewing throughout our 2-week family vacation, a trip that was supposed to repair our strained marriage, but had only highlighted the fractures. Vivienne had insisted on joining us, claiming she'd always dreamed of touring the French countryside. In reality, she'd spent every moment undermining me, criticizing everything from my accent when attempting to speak French to the way I held my wine glass. Last night's argument started over something trivial. I'd suggested we visit a local art museum instead of another vineyard tour that Vivienne had planned. "Always trying to control everything, aren't you, Margot?" Gideon had snapped, his eyes cold in a way I'd been seeing more frequently lately. My mother spent weeks researching these vineyards. The least you could do is show some gratitude for her efforts. I'd tried explaining that, after 7 vineyard tours in 10 days, I simply wanted to experience something different. But Vivian had swooped in, placing her bony hand on Gideon's arm. "Darling, it's fine." Clearly, Margot doesn't appreciate the finer things. Perhaps she'd be happier sitting alone in the chateau with her phone while we enjoy ourselves. The comment stung, because it played into Gideon's growing narrative that I was becoming distant and unappreciative. What he couldn't or wouldn't see was how systematically his mother had been isolating me throughout our 7-year marriage, creating friction where there had once been harmony. I'd retreated to the guest room, too exhausted to continue fighting. Now, as I watched their car disappear, the realization hit me with brutal clarity. This had been planned. The argument was merely a convenient excuse. I rushed to our room and checked the safe. Empty. My passport, credit cards, cash, all gone. My phone lay on the nightstand, but when I grabbed it, I discovered it had been factory reset. All my contacts, my photos, my connection to the world, erased. I frantically searched for my suitcase, finding it in the closet, but when I unzipped it, I found it empty except for a single note in Vivian's elegant handwriting. "Perhaps this will teach you that you never truly belonged in our family. Gideon finally sees you for what you are." Panic rose in my throat as I searched for any money they might have overlooked. Nothing. I was stranded in rural France, 40 miles from the nearest city, with no transportation, no money, no identification, and no way to contact anyone. Our rental payment for the chateau covered 3 more days. After that, I would be homeless as well. I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind racing. How long had they been planning this? Had our entire marriage been leading to this moment? The thought made me physically ill. Gideon and I had met at a charity gala in Boston 8 years ago. He was charming, successful, from a wealthy family with deep New England roots. I was working as an administrative assistant at the museum hosting the event, only there because a coworker had fallen ill. Our worlds shouldn't have collided, but they did. He pursued me relentlessly, showering me with attention and affection I'd never experienced before. When he proposed 6 months later, Vivian's disapproval was immediate and unmistakable. "A temporary assistant with no family connections? Surely you can do better, Gideon," she'd said right in front of me at their family estate. But Gideon had defended me then, telling his mother that he'd found someone special and wouldn't let her prejudices interfere. Gradually, though, things changed. After we married, Gideon insisted I quit my job. "My wife doesn't need to work," he'd declared. I lost touch with my friends, as Gideon preferred socializing exclusively with his circle. Slowly, I became isolated, dependent, exactly the way Vivian wanted me. And now they had completed the process by abandoning me in a foreign country. I took a deep breath, forcing down the panic. I needed to think clearly. The chateau manager, Monsieur Laurent, would arrive tomorrow for his weekly check-in. I could explain the situation, ask to use his phone, but what would I say? Who would I call? Most of my friends had drifted away years ago, and I had no family to speak of. My parents had died when I was in college, and I was an only child. The humiliation of explaining that my husband had abandoned me was almost as overwhelming as the predicament itself. I spent that first day taking inventory of what I had. The chateau's kitchen was well stocked. At least I wouldn't starve immediately. I found a handful of euros in a drawer, likely forgotten by previous guests. Not enough to get anywhere significant, but something. The chateau had a small library, and among the books, I discovered an old road map of the Loire Valley. There was a town called Saint-Aubin, about 7 miles away. Perhaps I could walk there and find help. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the old chateau sent my heart racing, imagining Gideon and Vivienne returning to further torment me. By morning, exhaustion had given way to something unexpected, anger, not just at them, but at myself. How had I allowed this to happen? How had I become so dependent that being abandoned in a foreign country could destroy me? I wasn't going to let it. I refused to be the victim they clearly expected me to be. When Monsieur Laurent arrived the next day, I carefully considered my approach. Pride suggested I should hide my situation, but practicality won out. "Monsieur Laurent," I began, in my limited French, "I have a problem. My husband and his mother have left unexpectedly. They took my passport and money. I need to contact the American embassy." His expression shifted from confusion to concern. "Madame Blackwood, this is very serious. You are certain this was not a misunderstanding?" I showed him the empty safe, the reset phone, the note Vivian had left. His face darkened with each piece of evidence. "This is criminal, madame," he said finally. "We must contact the police as well." The next few hours were a blur. Monsieur Laurent drove me to the local gendarmerie, where I filed a report about my stolen passport and belongings. The officers were sympathetic, but not particularly helpful. It was my word against my husband's, and for all they knew, this was simply a marital dispute that would resolve itself. The American embassy in Paris was marginally more useful. They could issue an emergency passport, but I would need to come to Paris in person with proof of identity. Without my driver's license or birth certificate, this would be complicated. They suggested I have someone from home send copies of my identification documents. "Is there someone you can call for help?" the embassy official asked over the phone. I hesitated. There was one person, Claudia Fisher, my former co-worker from the museum. We'd been close once, before my marriage isolated me. I hadn't spoken to her in nearly 3 years, but she was the only person I could think of who might still care enough to help. Monsieur Laurent allowed me to use his phone to make the international call. My hands trembled as I dialed, rehearsing explanations that wouldn't sound as pathetic as the truth. "Hello?" Claudia's voice was exactly as I remembered it, warm and slightly husky. "Claudia, it's Margot. Margot Taylor? Well, Blackwood now." A pause. "Margot? My God, it's been forever. Are you okay? You sound strange." The concern in her voice broke something in me, and to my horror, I began to cry. Through sobs, I explained my situation. The abandonment, the stolen documents, being stranded in rural France. Those absolute monsters. She breathed when I finished. "Tell me where you are. I'm going to help you. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly followed by shame. I'm so sorry to drag you into this, Claudia. We haven't spoken in years, and the first time I call, it's because I need something. Stop that right now, she said firmly. Friends don't have expiration dates. I always knew something was wrong when you suddenly disappeared from everyone's lives. Now, I know I was right. With Claudia's help, arrangements were made. She would send copies of documents that could help establish my identity. We had once rented an apartment together, and she still had old leases with my signature and information. She also promised to wire me money to a Western Union in the nearest large town, which Monsieur Laurent offered to drive me to. I don't know how I'll ever repay you, I told her. Just get yourself home safely, she replied, and then we'll figure out how to make those two pay for what they've done. But as I hung up the phone, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't sure I wanted to go home. Home meant Boston, where Gideon controlled our social circle, our finances, our life. Home meant facing the humiliation of explaining to everyone why I had returned from France alone. Home meant confronting the ruins of a marriage that had apparently been built on sand. I thanked Monsieur Laurent profusely for his help and asked if I could remain at the chateau until the rental period ended in 3 days. He agreed, even offering to extend my stay at a reduced rate if I needed more time. What you have experienced, madame, it is not right, he said gravely. If there is anything else I can do to help, please ask. That night, alone in the grand chateau that had been meant for a family vacation, I made a pot of tea and sat at the kitchen table with a notebook I'd found. I began to write down everything I knew about my situation, every asset and liability, every possible next step. The exercise was meant to calm my racing thoughts, but it revealed something unexpected. Options. I had options. Yes, I could return to Boston, stay with Claudia while I filed for divorce and tried to rebuild my life. But that path felt like admitting defeat, playing into exactly what Gideon and Vivian expected. Or I could stay in France, at least temporarily. The idea was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. I spoke passable French from college courses. I had worked in art museums before meeting Gideon. France had museums, many of them. It wasn't an impossible scenario. But there was a third option, one that had been forming in the back of my mind since I'd watched that silver Mercedes disappear down the driveway. It was risky, potentially foolish, but the more I considered it, the more right it felt. I could use this abandonment as an opportunity, not just to escape Gideon and Vivian, but to reclaim something I'd lost long before they left me in France. The next morning, I woke with clarity I hadn't felt in years. I showered, dressed in the only clothes I had, yesterday's outfit, and walked the 7 miles to Saint-Aubin. The journey was long but strangely peaceful, giving me time to refine my emerging plan. In Saint-Aubin, I found the Western Union where Claudia had sent money, $1,500, that would give me breathing room to make my next move. I bought a cheap prepaid phone, some essential clothing, and a notebook to continue organizing my thoughts. I spent 3 hours at a small internet cafe, researching and sending carefully worded emails, one to the American Embassy, explaining that I would be staying in France longer than planned and would schedule an appointment for an emergency passport in the coming weeks. One to a lawyer in Boston, briefly outlining my situation and inquiring about international divorce proceedings, and one to an old contact I wasn't sure would remember me. By the time I returned to the chateau that evening, my improvised plan was taking shape. I would not be the abandoned wife, desperately finding her way back to a home that was never truly hers. I would be something entirely different. The next day brought a response from the old contact, Marcel Dupont, a French curator I'd met during my museum days. He remembered me and was intrigued by my situation. He couldn't offer employment without proper work permits, but he mentioned an American friend who ran a small art gallery in Lyon and might need temporary help. Off the books, of course. 4 days after being abandoned, I packed the few belongings I'd acquired, said goodbye to the chateau and the kindly Monsieur Laurent, and boarded a train to Lyon. The countryside flew past the window, beautiful and alien. I felt the same, like myself, but somehow foreign, detached from the woman who had arrived in France with a husband and mother-in-law 2 weeks earlier. The gallery in Lyon was small but charming, specializing in contemporary art from emerging European artists. The owner, Sylvia Winters, was an American expatriate who had moved to France 20 years earlier and never left. When I arrived with Marcel's reference, she studied me with shrewd eyes. "So you're stranded in France because your husband stole your passport and money?" she clarified after I'd explained my situation. "Yes," I admitted, fighting the shame that still bubbled up when I said it aloud. To my surprise, she laughed, not mockingly, but with genuine amusement. "Honey, we've all had terrible men in our lives, but that takes the cake. When my ex left me, at least he had the decency to do it in our own country." Her reaction was so unexpected that I found myself laughing too, a rusty sound I barely recognized. "I need help around here," Sylvia continued. "My assistant just left for art school in Paris. It's nothing glamorous, answering emails, receiving shipments, helping with installations, pouring wine at openings. The pay is modest, and I can offer the apartment above the gallery until you find something else. It's basically a glorified studio, but it's clean and in the heart of the city." I accepted immediately, relief washing over me. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was a start, a foothold in this new, unexpected life. That night, in the small apartment above the gallery, I sat on the windowsill, looking out at the lights of Lyon. My phone buzzed with a text from Claudia. "Any update? Are you coming home soon?" I stared at her message, feeling the weight of the word home. Boston wasn't home anymore. Perhaps it never truly had been. "Not yet," I typed back. "I found a temporary job in Lyon. Going to stay a while longer. Thank you again for everything." Her response came quickly. "Are you sure this is wise? What about divorce proceedings? Your belongings, your life there? All valid concerns, but they felt distant, like problems belonging to someone else." The woman who had shared a life with Gideon Blackwood felt increasingly like a character I had played rather than me. "I'll handle all that," I assured her. "But first, I need to figure out who I am without him." Working at Sylvia's gallery, La Lumière, was exactly what I needed. The days were busy enough to keep my mind occupied, but not so demanding that I couldn't process the seismic shifts in my life. Sylvia was a straight-talking, no-nonsense mentor who seemed to understand intuitively what I was going through. "Men like your husband," she told me one evening as we closed the gallery, "they don't love women. They collect them. You were just another acquisition that stopped amusing him." The bluntness of her assessment stung, but I couldn't deny its truth. In Gideon's world, people were possessions, to be acquired, displayed, and discarded when they no longer served a purpose. Weeks passed, and gradually I built a routine. Morning coffee at the cafe across the street, work at the gallery, evening French lessons with Emily, a university student who lived in the building and traded language practice for English conversation. Small, manageable pieces of a life that was entirely my own. I obtained an emergency passport from the American Embassy, but made no immediate plans to use it. Instead, I opened a French bank account with Sylvia's help, began researching the process of obtaining a proper work permit, and allowed myself to imagine a future in this country that had initially been the site of my abandonment. Through it all, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was forgetting something important. some detail about my old life that might be relevant to my new one. It nagged at me, particularly at night when the city quieted and my thoughts grew louder. The revelation came nearly 6 weeks after being abandoned during a conversation with Sylvia about the gallery's accounting. We were reviewing the monthly statements, and something about the columns of numbers triggered a memory. "Sylvia," I said slowly, "I need to make an international call." "A private one." She nodded, handing me her phone. "Take all the time you need. I'll finish up here." I climbed the stairs to my apartment, heart racing as I dialed a number I'd memorized years ago but never thought I'd use. It rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "Burke, Hoffman and Associates, this is Patricia speaking." I took a deep breath. "Patricia, this is Margot Taylor. I need to speak with Mr. Burke immediately. It's regarding account number 8294-JT7. A pause. "Miss Taylor? It's been years. One moment. I'll see if Mr. Burke is available." Seconds later, James Burke's gravelly voice came on the line. "Margot Taylor, I was beginning to think you'd forgotten all about us." "Never," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm calling from France, Mr. Burke. I need to know if the arrangement is still active." "Active and thriving, my dear. Your instructions were clear. No contact unless initiated by you. The account has grown considerably. May I ask what prompted this call after all this time?" I closed my eyes, remembering the day I'd sat in his office 7 years ago, just weeks before my wedding. My circumstances have changed dramatically. I need to access the account. "I see." His tone was professional, but held a note of understanding. "We'll need to verify your identity, of course. Given your location, that might be complicated." I anticipated that. "I can provide whatever documentation you need." We spent the next 20 minutes discussing logistics, how I would prove my identity, how the funds could be transferred internationally, what paperwork needed to be completed. By the time we ended the call, a plan was in place, one that would change everything. That night, I couldn't sleep. The possibilities swirling through my mind were too exhilarating. I'd spent 7 years believing I was trapped, dependent, powerless. But that had never been entirely true. I'd just forgotten the protection I'd put in place before stepping into Gideon's world. The next morning, I explained to Sylvia that I needed a few days off to handle personal business. "Of course," she agreed, studying my face. "You look different today." "Like you've remembered something important." I smiled. "I have." 3 days later, I sat in a private office at Banque Nationale de Lyon, watching as the transfer was confirmed. The balance, just over $2 million, now resided in my French account, money that Gideon knew nothing about, money that had been quietly growing while I diminished in my marriage. Before I met Gideon, I'd worked at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. It wasn't a prestigious position, but it had introduced me to the world of art acquisition and authentication. Through a fortunate series of events, I'd helped identify a misattributed painting that turned out to be worth significantly more than the museum had paid for it. The grateful donor had offered me a substantial finder's fee, money I'd invested rather than spent, sensing somehow that I might need financial independence one day. When Gideon proposed, something in me, some instinct for self-preservation, had prompted me to place those investments in a separate account, one that he would never know about. I'd almost accessed it several times during our marriage when things were difficult, but pride had stopped me. Now, that same pride fueled a different impulse. I wasn't going back to Boston, at least not yet. I wasn't going to play the role of victim, crawling back to pick up the pieces of a life that had been systematically dismantled. Instead, I was going to build something new, something entirely mine. 2 days later, I walked into an auto dealership in Lyon. The salesman approached. eyeing my simple clothes with poorly disguised skepticism. "May I help you, madam?" "Yes," I replied in my improving French. "I'd like to test drive the BMW 7 Series, the black one in your showroom." His eyebrows rose slightly. "That is a very exclusive vehicle, madame. Perhaps you would prefer to look at our more accessible models?" I smiled, enjoying the moment more than I should have. "The 7 Series, please. And after the test drive, I'll be paying in cash." The test drive confirmed what I already knew. The car was perfect. Powerful, elegant, understated. Everything my life with Gideon had not been. I signed the paperwork, arranged for delivery, and left the dealership feeling a curious mix of vindication and freedom. That evening, I composed an email to Claudia, explaining my decision to remain in France indefinitely. "I found something here I never had in Boston," I wrote. "Independence. I know it doesn't make sense, but being abandoned turned out to be the best thing that could have happened to me." Her reply came hours later. "I don't understand, but I support you. Just promise me one thing. When you finally confront Gideon, take pictures of his face." I want to frame it. The thought made me laugh, but it also crystallized something I'd been avoiding. Eventually, I would have to confront Gideon and Vivian, not because I needed closure, but because they needed to understand that their attempt to destroy me had failed spectacularly. But not yet. First, I had a life to build, choices to make that were entirely my own. I'd spent 7 years diminishing myself to fit into the space Gideon and Vivian allocated for me. Now, I had an entire continent in which to expand. Over the next 2 weeks, I consulted with lawyers about my options. Because Gideon had essentially abandoned me and stolen my possessions, I had grounds for divorce that would likely be favorable to me. The fact that I now had my own financial resources meant I could hire excellent representation. I also began looking for a more permanent place to live. As grateful as I was for Sylvia's apartment, it was time to establish my own home. I found a charming flat in the historic district of Lyon, with tall windows and herringbone floors that reminded me of the art galleries I loved. Through it all, I monitored the situation back in Boston through Claudia, who had become my eyes and ears there. According to her, Gideon had returned from France and immediately begun telling people that I had decided to stay in Europe indefinitely, that we had mutually agreed to separate. No mention of abandonment, of stolen passports, and money, of the cruelty of leaving me stranded. He was rewriting our history, as I'd known he would. 3 weeks after purchasing my car, I received a call from Marcel Dupont, my curator contact. "Margot, I have interesting news. There's an art auction in Geneva next week, some significant pieces from private collections. I remembered you mentioning your interest in authentication work. Would you like to attend as my guest? It could be a networking opportunity." I accepted immediately. Geneva was only a few hours' drive from Lyon, a perfect chance to take my new car on a proper journey. I arranged for time off from the gallery, packed a small suitcase with the new clothes I'd been gradually acquiring, and set out early on a Tuesday morning. The drive was exhilarating. The BMW handled the winding roads between Lyon and Geneva beautifully, and I found myself smiling as the French countryside gave way to Switzerland. For the first time since being abandoned, I felt not just okay, but genuinely happy, alive in a way I hadn't been for years. The auction was being held at a prestigious hotel in Geneva, drawing collectors and gallery representatives from across Europe. Marcel met me in the lobby, kissing me on both cheeks in the French manner. "You look well, Margot," he observed. "France agrees with you." "Freedom agrees with me," I corrected with a smile. He introduced me to colleagues, mentioning my background in authentication and my current work with Sylvia's gallery. I found myself engaged in conversations about art movements and market trends, drawing on knowledge I'd acquired years ago but had rarely used during my marriage. It felt like reconnecting with a part of myself I'd forgotten existed. After the first day of the auction, Marcel invited me to join a group for dinner at the hotel restaurant. As we were being seated, I heard a commotion at the entrance, raised voices, one of them hauntingly familiar. I turned slowly, my body recognizing the voice before my mind fully processed it, and there, arguing with the maître d', stood Gideon Blackwood, his mother Vivienne at his side. They were trying to get a table without a reservation, Vivienne imperiously insisting that surely the restaurant could accommodate them. Marcel noticed my sudden tension. "Margot, are you all right?" I couldn't speak. My heart hammered in my chest as I watched Gideon scan the restaurant impatiently, and then freeze as his gaze locked with mine across the room. The color drained from his face, his expression shifting from irritation to shock in an instant. Vivienne, noticing his reaction, followed his gaze. When she saw me, her eyes widened in disbelief. I could read the question in both their faces. How? How was I here, in an exclusive restaurant in Geneva, looking composed and prosperous, when I should have been struggling to survive? For a moment, we all remained frozen in this tableau, me seated confidently among respected art professionals, them standing awkwardly at the entrance. Then Gideon took a halting step in my direction, his face now attempting to rearrange itself into something resembling concern. "Margot!" he called, loud enough to draw attention from nearby tables. "My God, we've been worried sick. Where have you been?" The audacity of his performance was breathtaking. I felt Marcel stiffen beside me, sensing the tension without understanding its source. "Is that man speaking to you?" he asked quietly. I nodded, oddly calm despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "That's my husband, the one who abandoned me in France." Marcel's expression darkened. "Shall I ask him to leave?" "No," I said, finding my voice. "This confrontation was inevitable. I just didn't expect it to happen here." Gideon was approaching our table now, Vivienne trailing behind, her face a mask of calculated concern that didn't reach her cold eyes. "Margot," Gideon repeated, now standing before me, "what are you doing here? We've been searching everywhere for you." I looked at him, really looked at him, and wondered how I had ever found this man charming. His handsomeness now seemed like a thin veneer over something rotten. "Have you?" I asked, my voice steady. "How strange, since you left me in a chateau in France with no money, no passport, and no way to contact anyone." His face flickered with momentary panic before settling back into feigned confusion. "What are you talking about?" "We had an argument, yes, but then you disappeared. We reported you missing to the French authorities." The lie was so bold, so completely divorced from reality, that I almost admired its shamelessness. Almost. "Did you report the theft of my passport and wallet as well?" I asked coolly. "Or did you omit that detail when filing your missing persons report?" Gideon's mouth opened and closed, but before he could formulate another lie, Vivienne stepped forward, her skeletal hand closing around his arm. "This is hardly the place for such a discussion," she hissed, her eyes darting to the other diners, who were now watching with undisguised interest. "Margot, you're clearly confused. Perhaps we should go somewhere private to sort this out." I looked at this woman who had orchestrated my abandonment, who had whispered poison into her son's ear for years, and felt something close to pity. How small her world must be, how fearful, to devote so much energy to destroying someone who had never posed any real threat to her. "I'm not confused, Vivienne," I said clearly, "and I have nothing to discuss with either of you." Marcel cleared his throat. "Perhaps I can help clarify the situation." Madame Blackwood has been working at a respected gallery in Lyon for several weeks now. She is my guest at this auction as a professional colleague. Whatever story you're telling, monsieur, it does not align with the facts." Gideon's facade was crumbling now, desperation seeping through. "Margot, you need to come home. Whatever game you're playing, it's gone far enough. I'm your husband. You belong with me." The words that once might have swayed me, "You belong with me," now revealed themselves for what they truly were. Not a declaration of love, but of ownership. "No, Gideon," I said simply, "I don't belong with you. I don't belong to anyone." Vivian's expression hardened, her pretense of concern vanishing. "How are you supporting yourself?" she demanded, eyes narrowing as she took in my tailored dress, the elegant watch on my wrist. "Where did you get the money for all this?" I smiled, enjoying the genuine confusion in her eyes. "That's no longer your concern. Nothing about my life is your concern anymore." "We'll see about that," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You signed a prenuptial agreement, Margot. Everything you have, everything you are is tied to me." I leaned forward slightly. "Check again, Gideon." "The prenup protects what we brought into the marriage, and it turns out I brought more than you knew." The flash of uncertainty in his eyes was deeply satisfying. For the first time, he was considering the possibility that he didn't know everything about me, that perhaps the woman he'd married wasn't the simple, malleable creature he'd believed her to be. "This conversation is over," I said, turning back to my dinner companions. "Please excuse the interruption. As you can see, I'm dealing with some unfortunate personal matters." Marcel and the others nodded, their expressions a mix of sympathy and curiosity. Gideon stood frozen for a moment longer, clearly unused to being dismissed, especially by me. "This isn't finished," he finally said, his voice tight with anger. "Oh, but it is," I replied without looking at him. "It was finished the moment you drove away from that chateau. You just didn't know it yet." Security appeared then, summoned discreetly by the maître d'. Gideon and Vivian were escorted from the restaurant, Vivian's protests about their treatment audible until the doors closed behind them. As the tension broke, Marcel gave a low whistle. "Margot, I think you have a story to tell us." I took a sip of my wine, surprised to find my hand steady. "Yes," I agreed, "but perhaps after dinner. It's not a story that pairs well with good food." Later that night, I sat alone in my hotel room, replaying the confrontation. It hadn't gone as I'd imagined during those dark hours after being abandoned. There had been no tearful recriminations, no begging for forgiveness. Instead, I'd faced Gideon and Vivian with a composure I hadn't known I possessed. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Gideon, somehow having obtained my new contact information. "We need to talk. What you're doing is dangerous. Dangerous. An interesting choice of words. Dangerous to whom? Not to me. I was more secure now than I'd been in years. No, dangerous to him, to the narrative he'd constructed, to the control he thought he wielded." I didn't respond, but I knew this wasn't over. Gideon was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully, and Vivian would be furious that her plan had backfired so spectacularly. They would regroup, strategize, try to reclaim what they viewed as rightfully theirs, me, or at least the power they had once held over me. But I had changed in ways they couldn't begin to understand. The woman they had abandoned in France was not the woman who had confronted them tonight, and I was only beginning to discover what this new version of myself was capable of. The next morning, I rose early and checked out of the hotel, not wanting to risk another encounter before I was ready. As I handed my key to the receptionist, she passed me an envelope. "This was left for you, madam." Inside was a business card for a gallery in Berlin, with a handwritten note on the back. "Impressed by your knowledge at dinner. We're looking for an authentication specialist. Call if interested. I tucked the card into my wallet, oddly moved by this tangible evidence that my professional identity, the one I had abandoned for Gideon, was still viable, still valuable. In the parking garage, I located my BMW, its sleek black surface gleaming under the fluorescent lights. As I slid into the driver's seat, I realized I had a choice to make. I could return to Lyon, to the safety of the life I'd begun building there. Or I could drive in a different direction entirely. I started the engine, feeling its power vibrate through me. The GPS awaited my instructions. The open road offered possibilities in every direction. For the first time in 7 years, the choice was entirely mine. I entered coordinates and pulled out of the garage, pointing the car northeast, toward the German border. Toward Berlin, perhaps, or somewhere else entirely. The journey mattered more than the destination. As Geneva receded in my rearview mirror, I thought about the look on Gideon's face when he'd seen me across that restaurant. The shock, the disbelief, the dawning realization that he had miscalculated badly. It was an expression I would remember for a long time. But even sweeter was the knowledge that this was just the beginning. My story, the real one, not the version Gideon had tried to write for me, was finally underway. The German countryside unfolded before me like pages of a story I never expected to read. My BMW carved through mountain passes and sweeping valleys, each mile putting further distance between me and the life I'd left behind. I'd been driving for 3 hours since crossing the border, my mind racing faster than the car itself. My phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from Gideon, each one more desperate than the last. We need to talk. This is ridiculous, Margot. Come home. You're making a terrible mistake. Do you have any idea what you're doing to my reputation? His final message revealed everything. Not concern for me, but for how my independence reflected on him. I switched off my phone and focused on the road ahead. I hadn't planned to go to Berlin when I left Geneva, but the job offer intrigued me. Authentication work had once been my passion, examining brushstrokes and pigments, distinguishing genuine masterpieces from clever forgeries. It required an eye for detail and an instinct for deception, skills I'd honed to perfection during my years with Gideon and Vivian. Night was falling when I reached the outskirts of Munich. Fatigue tugged at me, so I checked into a boutique hotel, ordered room service, and allowed myself the luxury of a hot bath. As I soaked in the fragrant water, I realized I hadn't felt this peaceful in years. No one scrutinizing my choices, judging my words, diminishing my existence. Just me, making decisions for myself, answering to no one. The next morning over breakfast, I called the Berlin Gallery. The authentication position was legitimate, a 6-month contract with potential for permanent employment. The director, Herr Kaufmann, asked if I could come for an interview the following week. Actually, I said, surprising myself with my boldness, I'm currently in Munich. I could be in Berlin tomorrow. Excellent, he replied, sounding pleased. We have a piece arriving from a private collection in Vienna. Your timing is perfect. I ended the call, feeling a surge of excitement. My old expertise, once relegated to memories of a life before Gideon, was suddenly valuable again. As I prepared to check out, my phone rang, Claudia calling from Boston. I hesitated before answering, suddenly aware of how strange my situation would sound to someone from my former life. Margot? Thank God. I've been trying to reach you for hours. Claudia's voice was tight with concern. Gideon's telling everyone you had some kind of breakdown in Europe. He's working with the State Department to have you found and brought home for treatment. His exact words. My blood ran cold. He's lying. I'm perfectly fine. I know that, Claudia said impatiently, but he's convincing people otherwise. He showed up at my apartment yesterday with some official-looking man, asking questions about when we last spoke, whether you sounded unstable. They implied I could be charged with aiding a mentally incompetent person if I didn't cooperate. The room seemed to tilt slightly. I'd underestimated Gideon. I'd thought our confrontation in Geneva would force him to accept my independence, but instead, he'd chosen a more insidious approach, questioning my sanity. Listen carefully, I told Claudia. I'm going to send you documents, bank statements, employment information, photographs of me clearly functioning normally. If they come back, show them everything. Make it clear that I'm living independently by choice. What are you going to do? She asked. Continue building my life, I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. Gideon can spin whatever narrative he wants in Boston. I'm not there, and I have no intention of returning anytime soon. After hanging up, I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, my mind racing. Gideon's new strategy was both clever and cruel, playing on societal tendencies to doubt women's stability, particularly when they act outside expected norms. By positioning me as mentally ill rather than independent, he maintained his image as the concerned husband rather than the abusive one. I needed to counter this narrative immediately. I opened my laptop and composed a series of emails, one to my lawyer in Boston detailing Gideon's latest tactics, one to the American Embassy clarifying that I was living in Europe voluntarily, and one to Gideon himself. This last email was the most difficult to write. After several attempts, I settled on brutal simplicity. I am not mentally ill. I am not missing. I am living independently by choice. Any claim to the contrary is defamation, and I will pursue legal action if you continue this narrative. All further communication should go through my attorney. I attached photographs of myself at the Geneva auction, copies of my work agreement with Sylvia, and bank statements showing my financial stability. Let him try to portray me as unstable in the face of such evidence. Before leaving Munich, I took one additional precaution. I visited a local doctor and requested a psychological evaluation, explaining my situation frankly. The doctor was initially skeptical, but agreed after hearing my story. 3 hours later, I had official documentation stating that I was of sound mind and under no duress, a strange document to possess, but potentially invaluable given Gideon's tactics. The drive to Berlin was tense, my thoughts continually returning to this new threat. By attempting to label me mentally unstable, Gideon had escalated from merely controlling to truly dangerous. If he convinced the right authorities, could I be forcibly returned to the United States, placed under his guardianship? The possibility, however remote, was terrifying. Berlin welcomed me with gray skies and light rain, the city's famous blend of historical grandeur and modern edge blurred by weather. The gallery, Kaufmann Contemporary, occupied a renovated warehouse in what had once been East Berlin. Its high ceilings and exposed brick walls provided a perfect backdrop for the cutting-edge art it showcased. Herr Kaufmann was younger than I'd expected, perhaps 40, with stylish glasses and an intensity that reminded me of the most passionate curators I'd known in Boston. He toured me through the gallery, explaining their focus on emerging European artists and select authentication work for private collectors. "This is the piece I mentioned," he said, leading me to a small room at the back of the gallery. On an easel sat a painting I recognized immediately, a pastoral scene attributed to Thomas Gainsborough, the 18th century English master. "Private collector from Vienna," Kaufmann explained. "Purchased at auction in London last year. He's considering selling, but wants verification of the attribution first." I stepped closer, studying the brushwork, the composition, the subtle interplay of light and shadow. "May I?" I asked, gesturing to the painting. Kaufmann nodded, and I carefully lifted the canvas, turning it to examine the back. The stretcher showed appropriate age, The canvas had the right texture and discoloration for the period, but something felt off. A hesitation in certain brushstrokes, slight discrepancies in technique between foreground and background. "It's beautiful," I said carefully, "but I'd need to conduct a more thorough examination." "There are inconsistencies worth investigating." Kaufman smiled, clearly pleased. "That's exactly what I thought. Most people see the Gainsborough signature and stop questioning. You look deeper." We spent the next hour discussing authentication processes, infamous forgeries, and the gallery's current projects. By the time we finished touring the space, Kaufman was offering me the position without further formalities. "When can you start?" he asked. "Tomorrow," I replied. "I just need to find accommodation." "We keep an apartment for visiting artists above the gallery," he offered. "It's available for the next month. That should give you time to find something permanent." I accepted gratefully, and by that evening, I was settled in a spacious loft with exposed beams and a view of Berlin's eclectic skyline. As I unpacked my few belongings, I marveled at how quickly my life was transforming. 3 months ago, I'd been Gideon Blackwood's carefully controlled wife. Now I was an authentication specialist in Berlin, with a BMW parked below and a future limited only by my own choices. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity. The Gainsborough proved to be exactly what I'd suspected, a clever forgery, albeit one that had fooled several experts before me. My detailed analysis impressed both Kaufman and the collector, establishing my credentials firmly. More pieces came my way. A questionable Monet, an unusual Kandinsky, a collection of Renaissance-era sketches. Each presented unique challenges. Each sharpened skills I'd once feared were lost forever. I found myself thriving in this new environment, respected for my expertise rather than tolerated as someone's wife. I found a permanent apartment in Prenzlauer Berg, a neighborhood that reminded me of Boston's Back Bay, but with a distinctly European sensibility. On weekends, I explored Berlin's museums and galleries, absorbing the city's unique artistic energy. I made friends, other expatriates, gallery employees, neighbors who invited me for coffee and didn't question why I'd left my previous life behind. Through it all, Gideon's attempts to undermine me continued. Claudia reported that he'd escalated his concerned husband performance, consulting with psychiatrists about international treatment options and suggesting to mutual acquaintances that I was experiencing a profound dissociative episode. My lawyer assured me that without evidence of actual mental illness, Gideon had no legal standing to force my return. Still, the knowledge that he was actively working to invalidate my autonomy was deeply unsettling. Then, 2 months after my arrival in Berlin, Claudia called with news that changed everything. "You're not going to believe this," she said, her voice a mix of disgust and satisfaction. "Gideon's been arrested." I nearly dropped the phone. Arrested? For what? Financial fraud. Apparently, he's been embezzling from his family's company for years. The FBI raided his office yesterday. It's all over the Boston Globe. I sat down hard on my sofa, struggling to process this information. How? What happened? "Nobody knows exactly," Claudia continued, "but rumor has it that someone sent detailed financial records to the authorities, records that Gideon thought were destroyed years ago." My mind raced. Who would have access to such information? Who would have both the knowledge and motivation to expose Gideon's financial crimes? The answer came in an email that arrived later that day from Vivian Blackwood. My hand trembled as I opened it, expecting vitriol or threats. Instead, I found something entirely unexpected. "Margot," it began, "by now you've heard about Gideon's legal troubles. What you don't know is that I provided the evidence that led to his arrest. For years, I've watched my son descend into criminality, believing himself untouchable. I enabled this behavior, convinced that protecting the Blackwood name was paramount. I was wrong. Our treatment of you was unconscionable. There is no excuse, only explanation. I believed you threatened the carefully constructed world I'd built around my son. When you proved stronger than we anticipated, something shifted in my perception. For the first time, I saw Gideon clearly, not as the son I'd idealized, but as the man he'd become. I do not expect forgiveness, nor do I deserve it. But I wanted you to know that Gideon will no longer pursue you. His legal troubles will consume him completely. Live well, Margot. You've earned that right. I read the email 3 times, searching for hidden threats or manipulations. Finding none, I was left with a profound sense of disorientation. Vivian betraying her beloved son? The woman who had orchestrated my abandonment now claiming moral awakening? I didn't trust it, couldn't trust it. And yet, the outcome was undeniable. Gideon was facing serious criminal charges, his reputation in tatters, his ability to harass me severely limited. That night, I found myself unable to sleep, my thoughts circling endlessly around this unexpected development. Was Vivian telling the truth about her change of heart? Or was this some elaborate strategy I couldn't yet discern? The woman who had whispered poison into her son's ear for years was suddenly positioning herself as an unlikely agent of justice. Morning brought no clarity, but it did bring a call from my lawyer in Boston. The charges against Gideon are substantial, he explained. Wire fraud, money laundering, tax evasion. The prosecution has evidence going back at least 5 years. He's looking at significant prison time. And Vivian? I asked. Is she implicated? Interestingly, no. The evidence specifically exonerates her. In fact, some of the documentation appears to have been maintained by her explicitly to create a record of Gideon's activities. So Vivian had been collecting evidence against her own son, even while supporting his worst impulses. The calculation was breathtaking in its coldness. Had she been preparing for this betrayal all along? Was it insurance against a son who might eventually turn on her as he had on everyone else? Whatever her motivations, the practical result was freedom. With Gideon engulfed in legal proceedings, his campaign to undermine my independence had come to an abrupt halt. The anxiety that had been my constant companion since learning of his concerned husband narrative finally began to recede. That weekend, I drove my BMW out of Berlin, heading west toward the Rhine Valley. The day was clear, the autumn colors spectacular, the road open before me. For the first time since being abandoned in France, I felt completely unencumbered, not just surviving, but genuinely living on my terms. I spent the night in a small hotel overlooking the Rhine, drinking local wine and watching riverboats navigate the ancient waterway. The simple pleasure of choosing my own destination, setting my own pace, answering to no one's expectations but my own, these were luxuries I'd forgotten how to appreciate during my years with Gideon. As I drove back to Berlin the next day, I found myself thinking about the strange path that had led me here. If Gideon and Vivian hadn't abandoned me in France, I would still be trapped in that suffocating marriage, still diminishing myself to fit into their expectations. Their cruelty, intended to destroy me, had instead set me free. The irony wasn't lost on me. By attempting to discard me, they had inadvertently forced me to reclaim parts of myself I'd surrendered years ago. My career, my confidence, my capacity for independent decision-making, all had been reawakened by the very crisis meant to demonstrate my helplessness. Back in Berlin, I threw myself into my work with renewed energy. Kaufman was increasingly relying on my expertise, sending me to authenticate pieces in Paris, Rome, and Amsterdam. My reputation in the field was growing, and with it, my sense of professional identity. 6 months after arriving in Berlin, I received an unexpected invitation, a prestigious art auction in Boston featuring several pieces I'd authenticated. Attending would mean returning to the city I'd fled, potentially encountering people from my former life who believed Gideon's narratives about me. The thought was intimidating, but also strangely appealing. I'd been avoiding Boston not out of fear, but out of a desire to establish myself independently before confronting my past. Perhaps it was time to close that circle. I booked a flight, arranged for a colleague to handle my ongoing projects, and prepared myself mentally for the journey. Claudia was ecstatic when I told her I was coming, offering her guest room and promising to arrange meetings with friends who had never believed Gideon's lies. The flight to Boston was surreal, like traveling backward in time while remaining firmly anchored in my new identity. As the plane descended over the familiar harbor, I felt none of the anxiety I'd expected. This city had once been my prison, but it held no power over me now. Claudia met me at the airport, embracing me with tears in her eyes. "Look at you," she said, stepping back to examine me properly. "You're glowing." "Europe agrees with you." "Freedom agrees with me," I corrected, echoing words I'd spoken to Marcel months earlier. Boston had changed little in my absence, but my perception of it had transformed completely. Streets that had once felt constricting now seemed merely familiar. Places Gideon and I had frequented together, restaurants, shops, galleries, now appeared ordinary, stripped of the emotional weight I'd assigned them. The auction was being held at the Ritz-Carlton, drawing collectors and gallery representatives from across the country. I entered confidently, dressed in a sleek ensemble I'd purchased in Berlin, my demeanor that of a professional rather than a returning exile. Several people recognized me, their reactions ranging from surprised double takes to deliberate approaches. A former acquaintance from Gideon's social circle actually gasped when she saw me, clearly having believed his tales of my mental deterioration. "Margot, we heard you were unwell in Europe somewhere. As you can see, I'm perfectly fine," I replied coolly. "I've been working as an authentication specialist in Berlin. In fact, I certified several pieces in tonight's auction." Her confusion was evident. This confident, professionally successful woman bore no resemblance to the unstable, dependent creature Gideon had described. Before she could formulate a response, Kaufman appeared at my side, introducing himself as my Berlin colleague and effectively shutting down any further questioning. The evening progressed smoothly after that. I reconnected with former museum associates, exchanged cards with American gallery owners, interested in my authentication services, and generally established myself as a professional in my own right, not just Gideon Blackwood's abandoned wife. As the auction wound down, I stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. Boston's spring evening was mild, the hotel's garden terrace nearly empty. I leaned against the stone balustrade, reflecting on how dramatically my life had changed in less than a year. "You look well." The voice behind me was immediately recognizable. I turned slowly to find Vivian Blackwood standing there, elegant as always in black Chanel, her posture rigid with tension. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice calm despite the surge of adrenaline. "I'm still on the board of the museum sponsoring this auction," she replied. "I didn't know you would be attending." We regarded each other silently for a long moment. Up close, I could see that the past months had aged her. New lines around her eyes, a certain hollowness to her cheeks. Gideon's downfall had clearly taken its toll. "How is he?" I asked finally, surprising myself with the question. Vivian's expression tightened. "Awaiting trial, out on bail, but effectively under house arrest. He's not permitted to leave Massachusetts." I nodded, feeling nothing but a distant pity for the man who had once dominated my existence. "Why did you do it?" I asked, the question that had been haunting me for months. "Why turn on your son after defending him for so long?" Vivian looked out over the garden, her profile sharp against the evening sky. "I made a terrible mistake with Gideon. I taught him that he was entitled to whatever he wanted, that rules applied to others, but not to him. When I saw how he treated you, not just the abandonment, but the years of manipulation before that, I recognized my own handiwork." She turned back to me, her eyes dry but haunted. "I told myself I was protecting him, but in reality, I was enabling the destruction of his character. By the time I realized what I'd done, the pattern was set. He would use people, discard them, and move on, believing himself immune to consequences." "So you created consequences," I observed. "Yes." Her voice was barely audible. "Too late to save him from himself, perhaps, but not too late to prevent further harm." The admission was startling in its self-awareness. This woman, who had once seemed monstrous in her callousness, was revealing depths I'd never imagined existed. "I don't expect forgiveness," she continued, echoing her email. "What we did to you was unforgivable. But I wanted you to know that it wasn't about you, not really. It was about Gideon's belief that people are disposable, and my failure to correct that belief when I had the chance." I studied her face, searching for signs of manipulation or insincerity. Finding none, I was left with the unsettling realization that Vivian Blackwood was, in her own way, as much a victim of the toxic dynamics she'd created as anyone else. "I don't forgive you," I said finally, "but I'm grateful for the outcome. Being abandoned in France was the most terrifying experience of my life, but it led me to a freedom I might never have found otherwise." Something like respect flickered in Vivian's eyes. "Yes, I can see that. You've built something for yourself that Gideon can never touch." She straightened, adjusting her perfect posture as if preparing to depart. "I won't intrude on your evening further. I simply wanted to see for myself that you had truly landed on your feet." As she turned to leave, I called after her, "Vivian!" She paused, looking back. "Did you know about my separate account before you left me in France?" A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "No." That was the first clue that we had severely underestimated you. By the time we realized our mistake, you were already rebuilding your life. It was impressive. With that, she walked away, her heels clicking softly on the stone terrace, disappearing into the hotel without a backward glance. I remained outside for a long time afterward, processing the strange encounter. There was no neat resolution, no clean forgiveness, or satisfying revenge. Just complicated human beings making terrible choices, living with consequences, finding unexpected paths forward. 2 days later, I boarded a plane back to Berlin, my brief return to Boston complete. I had reconnected with old friends, established new professional connections, and confronted the ghosts of my past. But Boston was no longer home. Perhaps it never truly had been. As the plane lifted off, I thought about the bizarre sequence of events that had led me here. Abandoned in France with nothing, I had somehow found everything: career, independence, self-respect, even a strange sort of closure with the people who had tried to destroy me. The BMW I'd purchased in that first flush of financial freedom was waiting for me at Berlin Tegel Airport, a tangible symbol of how far I'd come. As I drove through the city that had become my home, I thought about what Vivian had said. I'd built something for myself that Gideon could never touch. She was right. The life I'd created wasn't defined by reaction to abandonment or revenge against those who had hurt me. It was built on rediscovered strengths, resurrected passions, reclaimed independence. It belonged entirely to me. That evening, I sat at my favorite cafe in Prenzlauer Berg, watching Berliners enjoy the spring weather. My phone buzzed with an email, another authentication request, this time from a gallery in Barcelona. The opportunity would mean travel, challenges, growth. I accepted immediately. As twilight settled over the city, I reflected on the strange, circular journey that had brought me here. The night Gideon and Vivian abandoned me, watching their car disappear down that chateau driveway, I'd believed my life was ending. In reality, it was just beginning. Sometimes the cruelest abandonment can lead to the most profound homecoming, not to a place, but to yourself.